Okay, so get this. Imagine a magazine so controversial that it sparks national debate, even gets banned from Pride events,
Oh, wow.
and even lands the creator in a foreign police interrogation.
Really?
Yeah, this is Destroyer, a gay magazine published in Sweden in the mid-2000s, and today we're taking a deep dive into its rise and fall, exploring why it ignited such a firestorm and what it reveals about art and freedom of expression and societal norms, especially when it comes to LGBTQ plus issues.
Yeah, it really was a cultural bombshell.
Yeah.
And you're right, it's not just about what was printed on those pages.
Yeah.
Destroyer really tapped into deep-seated anxieties about homosexuality in youth and just the power of imagery.
Right.
To understand the intensity of the reaction, we really need to dig into the social and political climate of Sweden at the time.
Right, and luckily we have an incredible primary source to guide us, Gay Man's Worst Friend by Karl Andersson, the magazine's founder and publisher. He holds nothing back detailing the magazine's journey from concept to controversy. I mean, he gives us a front row seat to the legal battles, the media frenzy, and the impassioned debates that Destroyer ignited.
Yeah, and what's fascinating about this book is how Anderson weaves his personal experiences with broader philosophical reflections. He's not just recounting events, but he's trying to make sense of them, trying to understand why Destroyer provokes such extreme reactions.
Okay, so let's unpack Anderson's vision. He describes Destroyer as a journal of Apollonian beauty. Now, for those unfamiliar with the term, it's rooted in ancient Greek philosophy and the writings of Camille Paglia, but just think of it as like a pure aesthetic appreciation of beauty, particularly the male form, separate from sexual desire.
And this is where Anderson's interpretation gets really interesting.
Okay.
He was particularly captivated by the image of the boy, the adolescent male, as the ultimate embodiment of this Apollonian ideal. He believed that this image had been unfairly demonized and stolen from gay culture, and he wanted to reclaim it through Destroyer's photography and articles.
So it wasn't just about showcasing attractive guys. He had a whole philosophical framework behind it. But of course, this immediately raised red flags for a lot of people.
Absolutely. Context is everything in the early 2000s. Discussions about homosexuality, especially in relation to youth, were already highly charged.
Right.
And Anderson, by focusing on adolescent boys, even though he insisted all models were of legal age,
Right.
he really tapped into a wellspring of societal anxieties and fears about pedophilia.
So he essentially walked right into a cultural minefield.
He did.
And the backlash was explosive.
Yeah.
Even established gay media outlets like QX initially refused to cover Destroyer, almost as if they were afraid to even acknowledge its existence.
It's as though they saw it as a threat, a potential liability that could undermine the progress they had made in gaining social acceptance.
Yeah.
And then there was the radio show P3 Homo, where Anderson was branded gay man's worst friend. They accused him of featuring models who looked underage, fanning the flames of outrage.
Wow, talk about being thrown under the bus by your own community.
Right.
It's like they were trying to distance themselves from him as quickly as possible, but all this negative attention, it had kind of an unintended consequence. It put Destroyer on the map.
Right. It's often said that there's no such thing as bad publicity.
Right.
And in this case, the controversy fueled curiosity.
Uh-huh.
People wanted to see for themselves what all the fuss was about.
And then Aftonbladet, Sweden's largest daily, runs an article with the headline, "Teenage boys are very beautiful," quoting Anderson directly. I mean, you can practically hear the collective gasp across the nation.
It became a soundbite that defined the entire controversy, simplifying a complex artistic vision into a shocking, easily digestible phrase.
Wow.
Suddenly, Anderson was a national figure, attracting attention from all sides.
Yeah.
He was both praised for his boldness and condemned as a threat to public morality.
Yeah, even neo-Nazi groups jumped on the bandwagon, using the controversy to further their own agenda by trying to link homosexuality to pedophilia.
It's a classic example of how extremists can exploit nuanced situations to promote their own hateful ideologies.
Right.
Anderson, in his attempt to challenge norms, he inadvertently provided ammunition to those who sought to demonize the entire LGBTQ plus community.
It's like he accidentally handed them a megaphone.
Right.
And then things escalate even further when Lena Nyberg, the ombudsman for children, steps in. I mean, this isn't just a media circus anymore. This is a matter of national concern.
Right. Nyberg was particularly worried about what she called illusion pornography, images that evoke child pornography, even if the models are legally adults.
Right.
She argued that Destroyer's photography, even if technically legal, could still be harmful.
So just to clarify for our listener, this concept of illusion pornography was pretty new at the time.
Right.
It wasn't about depicting actual child abuse. It was about creating imagery that hinted at it, blurring the lines and potentially fueling pedophilic desires.
Exactly. And Nyberg's involvement pushed the debate beyond the realm of artistic freedom and into the legal arena.
Wow.
Suddenly, there were calls to re-examine existing laws to see if they adequately addressed this new form of potential harm.
So here's Anderson, this independent publisher, suddenly at the center of a national debate about art and sexuality and the very definition of what's acceptable to depict. Did he just back down and shut it all down?
Nope, not a chance.
Yeah.
He's like a dog with a bone. He wrote opinion pieces, gave interviews, and even went head-to-head in a heated radio debate with the chairman of RFSL, Sweden's Federation for LGBT Rights.
I can only imagine the tension in that studio. It must have been like a verbal boxing match.
It was.
What were Anderson's main arguments? Did he try to explain his artistic vision?
Absolutely. He argued passionately that the accusations against him were rooted in homophobia, plain and simple.
Okay.
He saw it as an attempt to control and sanitize the image of gay men, to force them into a narrow box of acceptability.
So he's basically saying, don't tell me how to express my identity or what's beautiful. But it wasn't just about pushing back against societal norms. He actually had a run-in with the law, right?
Oh, yeah. And it's a wild story.
What happened?
Someone filed a complaint against him at the Swedish embassy in Prague, and he ended up being summoned for interrogation by the Czech police.
Hold on, he's being investigated in a foreign country because of his magazine.
Yeah.
That's insane. What happened?
Well, you can imagine the anxiety and fear he must have felt.
Right.
But he went, explained his work, and to his surprise, the Czech police actually dropped the investigation.
Wow.
They seemed to recognize that the complaint was likely motivated by homophobia,
Really?
and they even wished him luck with his magazine.
Wow, what a twist.
Yeah.
This goes to show how subjective these issues can be. What one person sees as offensive, another might see as art or even a form of social commentary.
Right. And it highlights the fact that Anderson was operating in a very gray area.
Yeah.
There were no clear-cut legal boundaries when it came to illusion pornography, and much of the reaction was based on individual perceptions and interpretations.
Okay, so he's facing backlash from the media scrutiny from the government and even international legal attention. That's not all right. He also ran into trouble with institutions that most businesses rely on.
Absolutely. Try running a magazine when you can't even find a bank or a payment processor willing to work with you.
Right.
Anderson faced constant roadblocks because of the stigma attached to Destroyer.
Yeah.
PayPal even shut down his account twice.
Seriously, that's unbelievable.
Yeah.
It seems like everyone was trying to shut him down, even if his work wasn't technically illegal.
It shows the power that institutions have to effectively censor or marginalize certain types of content.
Right.
They don't need to pass laws. It can simply make it impossible for you to operate within the system.
So what did Anderson do? Did he just give up?
Not a chance.
Uh-huh.
He was incredibly resourceful.
Right.
He even set up a separate website, selling a wide variety of magazines just to secure a credit card processor.
Wow.
He was determined to keep Destroyer afloat no matter the cost.
Talk about dedication, but even with his tenacity, I can't imagine it was easy to face opposition from all sides, even from within the gay community itself.
Right, and this is where The Gay Lobby, a Swedish television show, comes in.
Okay.
They did a report on Destroyer that Anderson felt was incredibly biased and manipulative.
So it wasn't just the mainstream media that was critical. He was also facing scrutiny from within his own community.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that some viewers of The Gay Lobby actually pushed back, accusing the show of reinforcing homophobic stereotypes and using unfair editing techniques to portray Anderson in a negative light.
Okay, so now we've got conflicting perspectives, even within the LGBTQ plus media. It seems like Destroyer really divided people, even those who generally shared similar values and goals.
Absolutely. It forced people to confront uncomfortable questions about representation, about who gets to speak for a marginalized group, and about the limits of tolerance, even within a community that prides itself on diversity and acceptance.
So we've talked about the intense backlash and the challenges Anderson faced, but let's shift gears a bit and actually delve into the magazine itself. What kind of content did Destroyer actually feature? What was it about those pages that caused such a stir?
Well, as we've discussed, photography was a central element. Anderson was obsessed with capturing what he saw as the essence of Apollonian beauty, particularly in young men. He believed that these images had a power and a significance that transcended mere sexuality.
Okay, but can you give our listeners some specifics? What kind of photos are we talking about here?
Well, he often featured boys from diverse backgrounds, including those from Eastern Europe and other parts of the world. The style varied, but there was a common thread of youthful energy, a kind of raw innocence that Anderson seemed drawn to.
I'm starting to see how this could be perceived as problematic, especially given the context of a gay magazine. Were there any articles or written content that could shed more light on Anderson's artistic vision?
Oh, absolutely. Destroyer wasn't just a photo album. Anderson included a variety of articles and essays, often exploring themes of art, philosophy, literature, and of course, sexuality. He wanted to create a space for intellectual exploration and discussion to challenge conventional thinking about beauty, desire, and identity.
So it wasn't just about shock value. There was a deeper intellectual layer to it. Did he ever explain his choice of models? Why focus specifically on young men?
He addressed this directly in several articles. He argued that his fascination with the boy was not about pedophilia, but about reclaiming a historical appreciation for male beauty that he felt had been unjustly demonized by modern society.
Interesting.
He even drew comparisons to ancient Greece and the Renaissance, where the male form was celebrated in art and literature without any shame or stigma.
So he's basically saying that our modern culture has become too puritanical, too afraid to acknowledge the beauty of the human form, regardless of gender or age.
Exactly. And he saw Destroyer as a way to challenge that puritanism, to push back against what he perceived as a culture of repression and denial.
But of course, not everyone was convinced.
Of course not.
His critics saw his arguments as mere justifications for his own questionable tastes and desires.
And it's this tension, this clash between artistic freedom and societal norms that makes Destroyer such a fascinating case study. It forces us to confront our own assumptions about beauty, sexuality, and the power of images to influence our perceptions and desires.
Okay, so we've got this provocative photography, this exploration of controversial themes, and this passionate defense of artistic expression. But what about the readers who is actually buying Destroyer?
That's a great question, and one that we'll delve into deeper in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll explore the demographics of Anderson's readership, examine the letters he received from his fans, and try to understand what they saw in Destroyer that resonated so deeply with them.
Stay tuned, folks. This deep dive is just getting started.
Welcome back. As we've been delving into this story of Destroyer, I've been struck by how it acts like a Rorschach test. It reveals as much about the viewer as it does about the art itself.
That's such a great point. It seems like everyone projected their own anxieties and preconceptions onto those pages, whether they saw it as a celebration of beauty or a form of exploitation or something in between.
Right. And this brings us to the question of Anderson's audience, who were these readers who were drawn to this controversial material. Were they just a fringe group, or did Destroyer tap into something broader within gay culture?
Luckily, Anderson kept meticulous records tracking sales and demographics. He shares these details in his book, and it turns out Destroyer had a surprisingly global reach.
Wow.
With readers in 37 different countries.
That's pretty impressive for an independent magazine facing so much opposition.
Right.
So it wasn't just a small niche group of people.
Exactly, and Anderson includes excerpts from reader letters in Gay Man's Worst Friend, which offer fascinating glimpses into their motivations. Some expressed a sense of validation and empowerment, feeling that Destroyer represented a side of gay culture they rarely saw depicted.
Interesting.
They appreciated its boldness and its willingness to challenge norms.
They felt seen in a way by a publication that dared to explore the complexities of desire and identity without apology.
Right.
It's almost as if Destroyer provided a space for them to embrace aspects of themselves that society often deemed taboo or unacceptable.
But based on the sales figures Anderson shared, those readers who supported his work were a very small minority compared to the overall gay community.
That's an important point to remember. It speaks to the fact that Anderson's vision was and remains highly controversial.
Right.
Even within the LGBTQ+ community, there's a wide spectrum of opinions on how homosexuality should be represented, particularly in relation to youth.
Which brings us back to the issue of institutional power and control. We talked about how Anderson struggled to find banks and payment processors willing to work with him.
Oh, those stories are unbelievable. Getting dropped by PayPal twice.
Oh, it's crazy.
I mean, it really shows how these companies can wield enormous influence, effectively censoring content they deem objectionable, even if it's not illegal.
It's like they were saying, we may not be able to shut you down legally, but we can certainly make it incredibly difficult for you to operate.
And this kind of pressure isn't unique to Anderson. Countless creators, from artists and musicians to filmmakers and writers, have faced similar challenges throughout history, especially those who push boundaries or challenge the status quo.
They might be told their work is protected under free speech, but then they find themselves systematically excluded from the very platforms and systems they need to reach their audience.
Right.
It's a subtle form of censorship, but incredibly effective nonetheless.
That's like being stuck in a labyrinth with invisible walls, constantly bumping into obstacles you can't quite see or understand. And it highlights the importance of having alternative platforms and distribution channels, especially for creators whose work might be deemed too controversial for the mainstream.
Anderson even got a taste of this exclusion within the gay community itself. He describes a pretty dramatic incident at Stockholm Pride where Destroyer was banned from Pride House.
The irony, as Anderson points out, is that Pride's theme that year was diversity.
Wow.
Yet here was a gay magazine being excluded for supposedly not aligning with the event's message.
It's almost as if they were saying, you're welcome here as long as you fit into our narrow definition of what it means to be gay.
It really speaks to the idea of respectability politics, the pressure for marginalized groups to present themselves in a way that is palatable to the mainstream.
Right.
And it raises the question of who gets to define the boundaries of acceptability, even within a community that prides itself on being open and inclusive.
It's a reminder that even within seemingly progressive spaces, there can be internal conflicts and power dynamics at play, especially when it comes to navigating the complexities of social acceptance.
And Anderson's experience with the gay lobby, the Swedish television show we discussed earlier, further complicates this picture.
Right.
It's one thing to face criticism from the mainstream media, but to be targeted by a show that's supposed to represent your own community, that's got to sting.
Especially when viewers of the show criticize them for reinforcing homophobic stereotypes through manipulative editing techniques.
Right.
It seems like Anderson couldn't catch a break no matter where he turned.
It's almost as if his very existence, his willingness to explore taboo themes and push against the boundaries of acceptable representation, was perceived as a threat. And this reaction speaks volumes about the cultural anxieties surrounding homosexuality in youth at the time.
Okay, so we've talked about the backlash and the censorship and the complex relationship between Destroyer and the LGBTQ plus community, but let's circle back to the content itself. We know photography played a central role, but what about the written pieces? What kind of themes did Anderson explore in those articles and essays?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, he was deeply interested in art, philosophy, and literature, and he used Destroyer as a platform to engage with these topics, often through a lens of sexuality and identity.
Did he feature any other writers or thinkers who shared his views?
Oh, absolutely. He published interviews with artists, writers, and other figures who embodied the Destroyer ethos, those who dared to challenge conventional morality and explore the darker, more subversive aspects of human experience.
Like who, for example, can you give our listener a sense of the intellectual landscape Anderson was cultivating within the pages of Destroyer?
Well, there's a really intriguing interview with Uni Druge, a well-known Swedish author who contributed to one of the issues.
Okay.
She's known for her provocative work that often explores controversial themes, and she herself faced accusations of promoting pedophilia.
So they kind of bonded over their shared experience of being ostracized for their art.
Exactly. It shows that Anderson wasn't just operating in a vacuum. He was part of a network of artists and intellectuals who were pushing boundaries and challenging societal norms, even if it meant facing public condemnation.
Was there anyone else who stood out?
There's a fascinating column by Bo Ikefors, a Swedish writer and publisher known for his provocative and often controversial work. He had a long history of pushing boundaries and challenging societal norms, so it's not surprising that he was drawn to Destroyer.
His inclusion definitely speaks to the kind of countercultural network Anderson was tapping into, and it's interesting to consider how this network might have influenced his thinking and his approach to publishing.
Right, it wasn't just about showcasing pretty pictures. He wanted to spark a dialogue to challenge conventional morality and provoke critical thinking about the very nature of sexuality, identity, and societal norms.
And speaking of provoking critical thinking, Anderson didn't shy away from addressing sensitive topics within the LGBTQ plus community itself, did he?
Not at all. He published articles that explored issues like age of consent laws, intergenerational relationships, and the internal debates within the LGBTQ plus community about how to navigate social acceptance and representation.
Topics that are still hotly debated today.
Exactly.
He clearly saw Destroyer as more than just a magazine. It was a platform for challenging assumptions and provoking debate.
And this brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of this deep dive, the glimpse it gives us into the mind of Karl Andersson himself.
Right.
What can we glean about his motivations, his worldview, and his understanding of the world around him.
It's one thing to analyze the content of the magazine, but I'm also curious about the man behind it all.
Right.
What kind of person takes on this kind of project, knowing the risks and the potential backlash?
Well, based on his writing in Gay Man's Worst Friend, Anderson comes across as a complex and often contradictory figure. He's fiercely independent, incredibly intelligent, and deeply passionate about his beliefs, even when they put him at odds with the majority.
I'm also getting a sense that he's a bit of provocateur, someone who enjoys pushing buttons and challenging conventional thinking. He doesn't seem afraid of controversy. In fact, he almost seems to embrace it.
You're absolutely right, and that's what makes him such a fascinating subject.
Right.
He's not easily categorized or pigeonholed. He's a bundle of contradictions, idealistic yet pragmatic, intellectual yet sensual, defiant yet vulnerable.
And he's not afraid to be honest about his own struggles and anxieties, which makes him strangely relatable even when his views are controversial.
One of the things that struck me about his book is how he seamlessly interweaves his personal experiences, his philosophical musings, and his detailed accounts of the Destroyer saga.
Right.
It's almost as if he's inviting the reader into his thought process, allowing us to see the world through his eyes, to laugh at flaws and all.
He's not trying to portray himself as a hero or a martyr.
Yeah.
He's just a guy who had a vision, who believed in something deeply, and who was willing to fight for it, even when it meant becoming a social pariah.
And that unwavering commitment to his vision, even in the face of such intense opposition, is both admirable and unsettling.
Right.
It raises questions about the limits of artistic freedom, the responsibility of creators to consider the potential consequences of their work, and the ethical dilemmas involved in representing marginalized groups, especially those involving youth.
So we've explored the backlash, the content, and the man behind the magazine. But as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm left wondering, what was the lasting impact of Destroyer? Did it ultimately achieve what Anderson set out to do?
That's the million-dollar question, and one we'll grapple with in the final part of our deep dive. We'll explore Destroyer's complicated legacy, examining its impact on both Anderson himself and the broader cultural landscape.
So, as we've been unpacking the story of Destroyer, I keep coming back to Anderson's decision to end the magazine after just 10 issues.
It is a bit of a head-scratcher, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
he poured his heart and soul into this project, weathered relentless storms of controversy, and even managed to carve out a space for himself within, a very specific subculture, so why walk away?
Well, in his final editorial, he talks about feeling a sense of completion, like he had made his statement, ignited the conversation he wanted to spark, and it was time to move on.
It's a perspective that echoes the work of, certain artists who intentionally create finite bodies of work.
Right.
They make their mark and then step back, letting the work stand on its own. And remember, he made this decision before the 4th issue even went to print.
Wow. So he had this 10-issue arc in mind from the very beginning, almost like chapters in a novel.
It really speaks to his artistic vision and his integrity. He wasn't swayed by sales figures or external pressures. He stayed true to his original concept, which is pretty remarkable considering the financial and emotional roller coaster he was on.
He even compares Destroyer to a bomb in that editorial.
Wow.
He knew it would explode on impact, and he was prepared for the fallout.
And explode, it did. The Destroyer left a crater in the cultural landscape,
Right.
forcing people to confront uncomfortable questions about art and desire and the limits of tolerance. And those ripples are still felt today.
But it's also important to acknowledge the human cost of that explosion. Anderson doesn't shy away from the pain and isolation he experienced as a result of the intense criticism and the accusations leveled against him.
Right, being branded Gay Man's Worst Friend by a prominent radio show within your own community, that kind of public shaming can be incredibly damaging, both personally and professionally. And we have to remember he was also dealing with legal threats and financial instability on top of everything else.
It's a stark reminder that pushing boundaries, challenging norms, often comes with a heavy price.
And it raises questions about responsibility. When you put something out into the world, especially something as provocative as Destroyer, you have to be prepared for the consequences, both intended and unintended.
And speaking of consequences, one thing that's been nagging at me is the perspective of those young men featured in the magazine. Anderson focuses heavily on his own experiences, but we don't really hear from the models themselves.
That's a crucial point. We can analyze Anderson's artistic intentions all day long, but we also have to consider the potential impact on those he photographed, particularly given their age and the controversial context.
Did they fully understand the implications of being featured in Destroyer? Did they feel exploited in any way we simply don't know?
And that silence, that lack of perspective, adds another layer of complexity to the whole story.
Right.
It highlights the importance of considering power dynamics in artistic collaborations, especially when dealing with sensitive subjects.
It's a reminder that consent and agency are crucial, and that ethical considerations should always be at the forefront, even when pushing artistic boundaries.
Right, and these questions about consent and representation are even more relevant today in the age of social media, where images can be shared and recontextualized in ways that were unimaginable back in the early 2000s.
It makes you wonder how Anderson's story might have unfolded differently in today's digital landscape. Would he have faced even fiercer backlash, or would he have found a wider, more accepting audience online?
It's hard to say, but one thing's for sure, the conversation he started, the questions he raised about art and beauty, and the representation of marginalized identities are just as relevant and thought-provoking today as they were 20 years ago.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Destroyer, I'm left with a mix of admiration and unease admiration for Anderson's unwavering commitment to his vision, his intellectual curiosity, and his willingness to challenge the status quo.
But also unease about the potential harm that his work might have caused, both to himself and to others.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that even the most well-intentioned art can have unintended consequences.
It's a complicated legacy full of contradictions and unanswered questions, but ultimately I think that's what makes Destroyer so compelling. It forces us to confront our own assumptions, our own biases, and to engage in difficult but necessary conversations about art and ethics and the ever-evolving understanding of human sexuality.
So, dear listener, as we leave you to ponder the enduring legacy of Destroyer, we encourage you to explore the source material for yourself, to delve into Anderson's own words, and to form your own conclusions about this controversial chapter in cultural history.
And perhaps most importantly, let this story inspire you to engage in thoughtful dialogue with others, to challenge your own assumptions, and to continue exploring the complex and multifaceted world around us.
Until next time, keep diving deep.